Tears stained the mahogany table as Felicia signed her marriage away, a stark contrast to the blinding flash of paparazzi cameras capturing her husband's new romance just outside the glass doors. David had traded their 10 years of sacrifice for a 22-year-old runway model, leaving Felicia with nothing but a shattered heart and a single packed suitcase. But karma plays a long, beautiful game. Nobody could have predicted that the heartbroken woman walking out into the freezing rain that Tuesday afternoon would return 5 years later, not just as a survivor, but as the untouchable wife of a reclusive billionaire, flanked by 3 breathtaking heirs who carried a secret that would bring her ex-husband to his knees. The air inside the conference room of Harrison, Miller and Associates was suffocatingly dry, smelling of expensive leather and stale coffee. Felicia Jennings stared at the stack of papers sitting squarely in front of her. At the top, printed in bold, uncompromising letters, were the words, "Marital Settlement Agreement." Across the wide expanse of the table sat David Sterling. He was no longer the exhausted, passionate engineering student she had fallen in love with at Cornell. That boy used to split a single bowl of instant noodles with her on a mattress on the floor. The man sitting across from her now wore a bespoke Italian suit that cost more than their first car. His hair was perfectly styled, his jaw clenched not with sadness, but with impatience. He kept checking his Rolex, a gift Felicia had saved up for 3 years to buy him for his 30th birthday. "Felicia, we've been over this," David said, his voice devoid of the warmth that used to anchor her soul. "The terms are more than generous. You get the condo in the suburbs and a lump sum of $300,000. It's enough to start over." "Start over," Felicia whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She looked up, her red-rimmed eyes locking onto his. "I gave you my 20s, David. I sold my grandmother's heirloom ring to buy the servers for your first app. I worked double shifts at the diner so you could code without worrying about rent. I didn't just support you, I built you." David sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose in a gesture of exaggerated exhaustion. "And I'm compensating you for that. Sterling Tech is worth over $50 million now. You were a supportive wife, yes, but you didn't write the code. You didn't secure the venture capital. Let's not rewrite history to make you the martyr. We grew apart. It happens." "We didn't grow apart," Felicia shot back, a sudden surge of adrenaline piercing her grief. "You grew a wandering eye." The lawyer beside David cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. But David didn't even have the grace to look ashamed. Why would he? The reason for their divorce was currently waiting for him in a silver Mercedes idling at the curb downstairs. Vanessa Croft. She was 22, a rising lingerie model with legs that went on for miles, pouty lips, and a massive Instagram following. David had met her at a launch party Felicia had stayed home from because she had a fever. 6 months later, Felicia found the texts. They weren't just physical, they were humiliating. David had complained to Vanessa that Felicia was stuck in the past, that she was too simple for the life he was now leading. "Sign the papers, Felicia," David said coldly. "Vanessa and I have a flight to Milan in 3 hours. Don't make this uglier than it needs to be." Felicia looked at the pen resting on the document. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. She thought about fighting him, about dragging this out in court to get half of the company she rightfully helped build. But looking at the man across from her, she realized there was nothing left to fight for. The David she loved was dead. This stranger was just a vessel of ego and greed. She uncapped the pen. The scratch of the nib against the thick parchment sounded deafening in the quiet room. Felicia Jennings. She didn't use his last name. Not anymore. When she pushed the papers across the table, David's shoulders visibly relaxed. He offered a tight, polite nod, the kind you give a barista who hands you your coffee, and stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "Take care of yourself, Felicia," he muttered, before turning on his heel and walking out. He didn't look back. Felicia sat alone in the conference room long after the lawyers had packed up and left. The silence was absolute, pressing in on her eardrums. She eventually gathered her coat and walked out into the biting December wind of Chicago. As she stood on the pavement waiting for a cab, she saw it. The silver Mercedes was still stuck in traffic at the end of the block. Through the tinted glass, she could see David leaning over the center console, kissing Vanessa passionately. The model was laughing, her hands tangled in his hair. A wave of intense nausea washed over Felicia. She doubled over, clutching her stomach as a bitter taste rose in her throat. She blamed it on the stress, the lack of sleep, the heartbreak. She hailed a cab, climbed inside, and watched the life she had built disappear in the rearview mirror. She didn't know it yet, but the nausea had absolutely nothing to do with her ex-husband's betrayal. It was the first sign of a secret that would alter the course of her life forever. 2 months later, the relentless grey rain of Seattle battered against the single window of Felicia's cramped studio apartment. She had fled Chicago the week after the divorce was finalized, desperate to put 3,000 miles between herself and the ubiquitous tabloid photos of tech billionaire David Sterling and supermodel Vanessa Croft. Seattle was a fresh start. She had taken her meager divorce settlement, locked most of it away in a high-yield savings account, and taken a grueling entry-level job as an administrative assistant at a massive private equity firm, Vanguard Holdings. It was a massive step down from managing the operations of a startup, but she needed health insurance, desperately. Felicia sat on the edge of her lumpy mattress, staring blindly at the beige wall. In her hand, she clutched a crumpled sonogram photo. Triplets. The word echoed in her mind, a terrifying, impossible drumbeat. When she had missed her second period, she assumed it was trauma-induced amenorrhea. When the morning sickness became an all-day violent affair, she blamed the cheap diner food she was surviving on. Finally, she had gone to a free clinic, only to be referred to an OB/GYN specialist, Dr. Evans, due to her unusually high hormone levels. She remembered the chilling silence in the ultrasound room just hours ago, the cold gel on her stomach, Dr. Evans squinting at the black and white screen, moving the wand aggressively. "Well, Miss Jennings," the doctor had said, her voice tight with surprise. "It appears we have an explanation for your extreme symptoms. I see 1, 2, 3 distinct gestational sacs, and 3 strong heartbeats." Felicia had passed out right there on the examination table. Now, sitting in the gloom of her apartment, the reality crashed down on her. She was carrying 3 babies, David's babies. The timing was undeniable. They had slept together exactly once in their final months of marriage, a desperate, tearful night where Felicia had tried to bridge the growing chasm between them. Her phone sat on the nightstand. She could call him. She could tell him. A man making $50 million a year could afford to support 3 children. But then she remembered the coldness in his eyes. She remembered Vanessa's mocking smile on Instagram, wearing the diamond necklace David had bought her. If she told David, he would either demand a paternity test, accuse her of trapping him, or worse, he would use his immense wealth to take the children away from her, handing them to a 22-year-old stepmother who barely knew how to boil water. "No," Felicia whispered aloud in the empty room. She placed her hands over her still flat stomach. "You are mine. only mine. He doesn't get to ruin you, too. The next 6 months were a masterclass in human endurance. Felicia worked 12-hour days at Vanguard Holdings. She wore oversized, cheap thrift store sweaters to hide her rapidly expanding waistline. She survived on saltines, ginger ale, and an ironclad will. She became indispensable at work, quietly fixing financial models left behind by junior analysts, organizing the chaotic schedules of the executives, and never, ever complaining. It was during one of these grueling late-night shifts that she met Nathaniel Reed. Nathaniel was the CEO and founder of Vanguard Holdings. At 36, he was a self-made billionaire, known in the financial world as a ruthless, brilliant operator. He was also famously reclusive, rarely speaking to lower-level staff. He had piercing blue eyes, an aggressively sharp jawline, and a reputation for firing people who wasted his time. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Friday. The massive office was entirely empty, save for the hum of the HVAC system and the clicking of Felicia's keyboard. She was 7 months pregnant with triplets, her body aching with a profound, terrifying heaviness. She was desperately trying to finish a risk assessment report that a lazy vice president had dumped on her desk at 4 p.m. Suddenly, the heavy glass doors of the executive suite pushed open. Nathaniel Reed walked out, looking exhausted, his tie undone. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the single desk lamp illuminated in the bullpen. He walked over slowly. Felicia didn't hear him until he was standing right behind her chair. "Who gave you this model to run?" Nathaniel's deep, baritone voice startled her so badly she gasped, dropping her pen. She spun around, her heart hammering. "Mr. Reed, I'm sorry, I was just finishing up." Nathaniel's eyes flicked from the complex spreadsheet on her screen down to her. Due to her sudden movement, her oversized sweater had caught on the armrest, pulling tight across her massive, undeniable pregnancy bump. He froze. For a man who controlled billions of dollars with ice-cold precision, he looked utterly, entirely derailed. "You are," he started, gesturing vaguely. "You're very pregnant." "Yes, sir," Felicia said, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She tried to pull the sweater down. "I assure you, it doesn't affect my work performance." Nathaniel's brow furrowed angrily. "Who is your direct manager?" "Gregory Vance. Mr. Vance, sir." "Wait, constraint check. No Vance. Let's use Gregory Higgins." "Gregory Higgins, sir," she corrected herself quickly. "Higgins dumped his quarterly risk analysis on a pregnant administrative assistant at midnight on a Friday." Nathaniel's voice was dangerously low. "I offered to help," Felicia lied, terrified of losing her job. Nathaniel stared at her. He looked at the bags under her eyes, the paleness of her skin, and then at the screen, noticing the flawless formulas she had inputted, work far beyond her pay grade. "Pack up your things," Nathaniel ordered. Felicia's breath hitched. Tears sprang to her eyes. "Please, Mr. Reed, I need this job. I'm having triplets. I need the insurance. I'll work faster, I promise." "Stop," Nathaniel interrupted, his voice softening just a fraction. He pulled a chair over and sat down so he was eye level with her. "I'm not firing you. I'm telling you to go home because you look like you're going to collapse. And effective Monday, you no longer work for Higgins. You are my new personal financial liaison. The pay is triple whatever you're making now, with full executive medical benefits." Felicia stared at him, her mouth agape. "Why?" Nathaniel looked at the screen again, a ghost of a sad smile playing on his lips. "Because I recognize someone who is fighting for their life. And Vanguard doesn't waste talent. Go home, Ms. Jennings." The promotion changed everything, but it came with its own set of intense pressures. Working directly for Nathaniel Reed meant keeping up with a man whose mind, operated at lightning speed. To Felicia's own surprise, she didn't just keep up. She thrived. Stripped of the toxic shadow of David's ego, her own brilliant business acumen, the same acumen that had quietly built Sterling Tech, began to shine. Nathaniel was demanding, but he was incredibly protective. When her water broke violently in the middle of a board meeting at 34 weeks, it wasn't a panicked co-worker who drove her to the hospital. It was Nathaniel. He cleared his schedule, threw her in the back of his private town car, and yelled at the driver to run every red light to Seattle General. The birth was a chaotic, terrifying blur of screaming monitors, bright surgical lights, and immense pain. Because they were premature, the triplets, Leo, Max, and Mia, were immediately rushed to the neonatal intensive care unit. For the next 4 weeks, Felicia lived in the NICU. She sat in a rocking chair between the 3 plastic incubators, weeping as she watched their tiny chests rise and fall beneath webs of wires. She was utterly alone, or so she thought. Every evening at 7 p.m., without fail, Nathaniel Reed walked through the swinging doors of the NICU. He would bring her hot meals from high-end restaurants, forced her to eat, and then he would sit in the chair next to hers. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just offered his presence. One rainy Tuesday, as Nathaniel sat watching tiny Mia grip his pinky finger through the incubator porthole, Felicia finally asked the question that had been haunting her. "Why are you doing this, Nathaniel?" she asked softly, her voice raspy from exhaustion. "You're a billionaire CEO. You don't owe your assistant this level of care." Nathaniel didn't look up from the baby. His jaw tightened. "My mother was abandoned by my father when she was pregnant with me," he said quietly. "She worked 3 jobs to keep us off the streets. The stress killed her when I was 20. She died of a stroke because she couldn't afford her blood pressure medication. I promised myself, if I ever had the power, I would never let a woman fight that battle alone in my presence." He finally looked over at Felicia. His piercing blue eyes were incredibly soft. "You are brilliant, Felicia. You are fierce. But you don't have to do this by yourself." When the babies were finally cleared to go home, Nathaniel didn't let Felicia go back to her studio apartment. He moved her into the guest wing of his massive Medina estate. He hired a team of night nurses. He set up a nursery fit for royalty. What started as an act of profound protection slowly, inevitably, blossomed into something much deeper. Over the next 3 years, they built a life together. Nathaniel didn't just love Felicia. He worshipped her resilience. And he adored the triplets. He was the one who taught Leo how to walk. He was the one who read Max to sleep. He was the one who let Mia paint his nails on Sunday mornings. To the children, he wasn't Nathaniel Reed, the terrifying titan of industry. He was just Daddy. When the triplets turned 3, Nathaniel took Felicia to a private beach in Maui. As the sun set, painting the sky in violent strokes of orange and purple, he got down on one knee. "I don't just want to protect you anymore," he told her, holding a diamond ring that dwarfed the sun. "I want to partner with you. In life, in business, in everything. Marry me, Felicia." She said yes, and the wedding was the society event of the decade, though heavily guarded and fiercely private. The world knew Nathaniel Reed had finally settled down, but very few photos of his new wife were ever leaked. 2 more years passed. The heartbroken, terrified woman who had fled Chicago was gone. In her place stood Felicia Reed, the co-chair of Vanguard Holdings, a polished, ruthless, and terrifyingly intelligent powerhouse. She wore tailored Tom Ford suits, commanded rooms of seasoned executives without raising her voice, and possessed a bank account with a 9-figure balance. It was on a crisp autumn morning, 5 years after the divorce, that the past finally came knocking. Felicia was sitting in her massive corner office overlooking the Seattle skyline when Nathaniel walked in. He didn't bother knocking. He had a thick dossier in his hands and a predatory smirk on his face. "You're going to want to see this," Nathaniel said, tossing the file onto her glass desk. Felicia opened it. The bold logo of Sterling Tech stared back at her. "They're bleeding out," Nathaniel explained, pouring himself a bourbon from her cart. David Sterling might be a decent coder, but he's a catastrophic CEO. He expanded too fast, alienated his core engineers, and blew millions on vanity projects to impress that model he married. His board is about to oust him, and they are desperately looking for a buyout to avoid bankruptcy. Felicia scanned the financial documents. It was a bloodbath. David had run the company she had sacrificed her youth to build straight into the ground. "Vanguard is looking for a tech acquisition this quarter," Nathaniel continued, walking over and leaning his hands on her desk. "We could buy Sterling Tech for pennies on the dollar, liquidate his assets, strip him of his shares." He paused, his eyes gleaming with dark anticipation. "But I wouldn't dream of doing it without you. I want you to lead the acquisition, Felicia. I want you to be the face he sees across the negotiation table." Felicia stared at the signature on the bottom of the desperate financial plea. David Sterling. The handwriting was exactly the same as it had been on their divorce papers. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Felicia's lips. She closed the folder. "Tell the pilots to prep the jet," Felicia said, her voice dripping with ice. "We're going back to Chicago." The descent into Chicago O'Hare on Vanguard Holdings' private Gulf Stream G650 was remarkably smooth, but the turbulence in David Sterling's life was reaching a catastrophic peak. Inside the sleek, glass-walled conference room of Sterling Tech's downtown headquarters, the atmosphere was suffocating. David tugged at the collar of his Brioni shirt. It was 2 seasons old, a minor detail to most, but a glaring symbol of his current financial hemorrhage. His marriage to Vanessa was in shambles. Without the endless flow of cash to fund her shopping sprees on Oak Street and her lavish trips to St. Bart's, the 27-year-old model had turned vicious. Just that morning, she had hurled a crystal vase at his head because his credit card had been declined at a luxury boutique. But Vanessa was a problem for another day. Right now, David was facing the total annihilation of his life's work. His lead counsel from Kirkland & Ellis leaned in, his voice hushed and urgent. "David, remember, Vanguard Holdings is our only lifeline. The lead negotiator, S. Reed, is notoriously ruthless. They know we are weeks away from insolvency. We have to take whatever buyout they offer, or the board will strip you of your shares entirely by Friday." David swallowed hard, staring at the mahogany double doors. "Just get me enough to keep my majority equity. I just need time to pivot the software." "You don't have time," the lawyer replied grimly, "and you won't keep equity. We are begging for crumbs here." Precisely at 10 a.m., the heavy doors swung open. A team of 4 razor-sharp Vanguard lawyers filed in first, taking their seats with military precision. Then, the room seemed to undergo a sudden drop in barometric pressure. Nathaniel Reed walked in. The billionaire was a towering, imposing figure in a charcoal bespoke suit, his reputation preceding him like a thundercloud. The Sterling Tech board members collectively held their breath, but Nathaniel didn't take the head chair. Instead, he pulled it out, standing to the side. "Gentlemen," Nathaniel's voice was a low, commanding rumble. "Allow me to introduce the co-chair of Vanguard Holdings and the lead director of this acquisition, my wife, Mrs. Felicia Reed." David's heart stopped. The woman who walked through the doors was a ghost, resurrected in haute couture. Felicia, wore an impeccably tailored ivory Carolina Herrera suit that radiated untouchable power. Her hair, once kept in a messy ponytail to keep out of her face while she scrubbed their apartment floors, was blown out into a sleek, honey-blonde cascade. The exhausted, weeping woman he had discarded 5 years ago was entirely gone. In her place stood an apex predator. On her left hand rested a diamond so spectacular it caught the ambient light of the room and threw prisms across the walls. David's jaw unhinged. He tried to speak, but only a pathetic, strangled sound escaped his throat. Felicia didn't even blink. She walked to the head of the table, sat down, and folded her hands over the leather portfolio her assistant placed in front of her. She looked at David not with anger, but with the terrifying, clinical detachment of a scientist examining a dying bug. "Mr. Sterling," Felicia said, her voice smooth and chillingly calm, "let's not waste time with pleasantries. You don't have the runway for it." She opened the folder. "I have reviewed Sterling Tech's financials. The gross mismanagement over the last 4 years is staggering. You have squandered your R&D budget on vanity marketing, alienated your top developers, and leveraged your personal shares to cover private, exorbitant lifestyle debts." David's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. "Felicia, what is this? How did you— Address me as Mrs. Reed, or we conclude this meeting right now and let your creditors dismantle you by Monday," Felicia interrupted, her tone dropping 10 degrees. The Kirkland and Ellis lawyer kicked David under the table. David clamped his mouth shut, his hands shaking violently. "Vanguard is prepared to acquire Sterling Tech," Felicia continued, sliding a crisp, single sheet of paper across the massive table. "These are the terms." David pulled the paper toward him. His eyes scanned the numbers, and the remaining color drained from his face. Vanguard acquisition terms. Purchase price, $12 million. Assumption of all outstanding corporate debt. Executive restructuring. Immediate termination of the current CEO, David Sterling, with 0 severance package. Equity liquidation. David Sterling's remaining 40% founder's equity is diluted and transferred to Vanguard Holdings at a valuation of 15 cents per share. Intellectual property. Full, unencumbered transfer of the core algorithm, the very code Felicia had helped him conceptualize 10 years ago. This leaves me with nothing," David choked out, the reality of the paper suffocating him. "After the personal loans I took out to float the company, I'll be completely bankrupt. Felicia, Mrs. Reed, you know what I sacrificed to build this." "I know exactly what was sacrificed to build this company," Felicia replied, her gaze piercing right through his soul. "And I know exactly who did the sacrificing. You are being offered a dignified exit rather than a public bankruptcy. Sign the papers, Mr. Sterling. Don't make this uglier than it needs to be." The exact words he had used against her 5 years ago echoed in the silent room. David looked at Nathaniel, who was watching him with a predatory, mocking smirk. He looked at his lawyers, who were all nodding frantically, urging him to take the deal. Broken, humiliated, and utterly defeated, David uncapped his pen. With a trembling hand, he signed his empire away to the woman he had thrown out in the rain. News of the Vanguard buyout hit the financial wires by noon, and the social fallout was immediate. David returned to his mortgaged penthouse to find half the closets empty. Vanessa, having seen the Bloomberg alerts about his ousting and sudden lack of net worth, was in the process of frantically packing her remaining Louis Vuitton trunks. "Vanessa, please," David begged, standing in the doorway of their cavernous, echoing bedroom. "I can start over. I have contacts. We can rebuild." Vanessa paused, holding a handful of designer shoes. She looked at him with profound disgust. Rebuild? With what? You're broke, David. I didn't sign up to struggle. The paparazzi are already laughing at me online because your ex-wife is suddenly a billionaire and you're a laughingstock. I'm going to my sister's in LA. Have your lawyer call mine. She brushed past him, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume and the shattered remains of his ego. David sank to the floor, surrounded by empty hangars. He had traded gold for brass, and now he was left with nothing but rust. 2 days later, the reality of his new life forced him out of hiding. He had a scheduled lunch at the Peninsula Chicago, a reservation he had made months ago and couldn't bear to cancel, hoping to beg an old venture capitalist friend for a seed loan. The hotel's extravagant lobby was bustling with the city's elite. David sat at a corner table in the opulent restaurant, nursing a water he could barely afford, waiting for a friend who was already 20 minutes late. That was when he heard the laughter. It was bright, joyful, and completely out of place in the hushed, stuffy environment of the luxury hotel. David glanced toward the entrance of the dining room. Felicia was walking in. She was dressed down today, wearing a chic cashmere trench coat and designer sunglasses pushed up into her hair. Beside her was Nathaniel Reed, looking entirely relaxed, holding a tiny, impeccably dressed little girl in his arms. Trailing just ahead of them were 2 little boys, identically dressed in miniature navy blazers and khakis. They were about 4 years old. David froze. His breath caught in his throat. The maitre d' rushed forward, bowing slightly. Mr. and Mrs. Reed, your private dining suite is ready. Right this way. As the family passed by David's secluded corner, one of the boys, Leo, stopped to look at a massive floral arrangement. Come along, Leo, Felicia called out softly, her voice filled with a warmth David hadn't heard in half a decade. The boy turned, and David felt the earth drop out from beneath him. The boy had Felicia's bright, intelligent eyes, but the jawline, the unruly wave of his dark hair, the exact shape of his brow. It was like looking into a time machine. It was David's own face staring back at him from 30 years ago. David's mind raced, doing the frantic, agonizing math. 4 years old, gestation, 5 years since the divorce. The timeline locked into place with the force of a physical blow. Triplets. They were his. He had sons. He had a daughter. He had a legacy. Before he could stop himself, David stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. "Felicia!" he called out, his voice cracking, thick with desperate emotion. Felicia stopped. Nathaniel immediately stepped between Felicia and David, his massive frame shielding his wife, his blue eyes turning lethal. The 2 little boys quickly retreated behind Nathaniel's legs. "David," Felicia said, stepping slightly around her husband, her face an unreadable mask. "You are causing a scene." They're mine," David stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the boys, tears welling in his eyes as he looked at the little girl clutching Nathaniel's neck. "Felicia, tell me the truth. Are they mine?" Nathaniel's voice was dangerously quiet, vibrating with absolute authority. "You are speaking to my wife, Sterling, and you are looking at my children. I suggest you lower your hand before I have my security team break it." "Felicia, please," David begged, ignoring Nathaniel, tears finally spilling over his cheeks. The realization of what he had thrown away for a fleeting, shallow romance was physically crushing him. "I'm their father. I have a right to know." Felicia looked at the broken, weeping man in front of her. She felt no anger anymore, only pity. "You lost the right to know anything about my life the day you handed me those divorce papers to catch a flight to Milan," Felicia said softly. yet her words carried the weight of a judge's gavel. Biology doesn't make a father, David. Showing up does. Nathaniel was there for their first breaths in the NICU. He taught them to walk. He is their father in every single way that matters. But you made your choice 5 years ago, Felicia finalized, her tone resolute and unyielding. You chose Vanessa. You chose your ego. These children have a father who protects them, who loves them, and who would never, ever abandon them. Do not ever approach my family again. She turned away. Nathaniel gave David one last, chilling look of absolute dismissal before gently guiding his family toward the private dining room. David stood completely alone in the center of the opulent restaurant, the stares of Chicago's elite burning into his skin. He had wanted the world, and he had thrown away the universe to get it. Now, as he watched his children disappear behind the velvet curtains with another man, he finally understood the true cost of his betrayal. The days following the encounter at the Peninsula Chicago blurred into a waking nightmare for David. The image of his children, 3 living, breathing manifestations of his own flesh and blood, calling another man Daddy, was a poison that seeped into his every waking thought. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. The absolute totality of his failure was no longer just financial. It was deeply, irreversibly personal. Desperation drove him to make the worst tactical error of his life. He decided to fight Nathaniel Reed. Scraping together the last of a high-interest personal loan, David hired Arthur Pendleton, a notoriously aggressive family law attorney based in the Loop. Pendleton was famous for brutal, protracted custody battles among Chicago's elite. He smelled blood in the water and eagerly took David's retainer, promising that biology would ultimately triumph over Felicia's billionaire safety net. We file a petition to establish paternity in Cook County, Pendleton had declared in his mahogany-paneled office, exuding a false confidence that David desperately wanted to believe. Once we force a DNA test, the court has to recognize your parental rights. Reed's money can't rewrite basic biology, David. We will get you visitation. 2 weeks later, the motion was filed. The response from Vanguard Holdings was not merely a legal defense, it was a localized nuclear strike. Felicia and Nathaniel didn't even bother to fly back to Chicago. Instead, they dispatched a team of 10 litigators from Skadden, Arps, Slate, Mega, and Flom, led by a terrifyingly calm senior partner named Catherine Pierce. The hearing took place in a closed, sealed courtroom to prevent the tabloids from turning the Reeds' private life into a circus. David sat at the petitioner's table, his hands sweating profusely. He looked exhausted, wearing a suit that was beginning to hang loosely on his rapidly thinning frame. Across the aisle, Catherine Pierce stood up, adjusting her glasses with the chilling precision of an executioner. "Your Honor," Pierce began, her voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. "This petition is not only frivolous, it is a profound waste of this court's time, and a textbook example of targeted harassment against my clients, Mr. and Mrs. Reed." Pendleton scoffed. "My client is the biological father. He has an undeniable constitutional right to a paternity test." Pierce didn't even look at Pendleton. She handed a thick, bound folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. "Your Honor, you will find the birth certificates of Leo, Max, and Mia Reed in Exhibit A. You will note that the father is listed as unknown. My client, Mrs. Reed, was a legally single woman at the time of their birth, having been abruptly divorced by the petitioner months prior to discovering her pregnancy." David felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. "Furthermore," Pierce continued smoothly, "Exhibit B contains the finalized, unsealable adoption decrees from the state of Washington. 3 years ago, Mr. Nathaniel Reed formally and legally adopted all 3 children. In the eyes of the law, the federal government, and the children themselves, Nathaniel Reed is their father. Mr. Sterling has absolutely zero legal standing to request a paternity test for children who already have a legally recognized, providing, and deeply involved father. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with 30 years on the bench, flipped through the documents. She looked over her glasses at David, her expression one of profound distaste. "Mr. Pendleton," the judge said, her voice dripping with irritation. "Did you not bother to check the adoption registry in Washington before filing this absurd motion?" The rights of any potential biological father were permanently extinguished the moment the adoption was finalized, especially given that your client made zero effort to establish paternity or support in the years prior. "Your Honor, my client didn't know," Pendleton protested, though his voice had lost its bluster. "Ignorance is not a legal shield against abandonment," the judge snapped. "Mr. Sterling divorced his pregnant wife and left her to fend for herself. Another man stepped up, provided for them, and legally claimed them as his own. The law protects the stability of the family unit, not the belated regrets of an absent biological contributor. Case dismissed with prejudice. And Mr. Pendleton, if you bring my court another stunt like this, I will personally see you sanctioned." The gavel fell. The sound echoed in David's ears like a gunshot. It was over. Legally, practically, and eternally. He would never hold them. He would never hear them call him Dad. He was nothing but a ghost they would never have to know. The legal defeat was the final domino. The remaining structure of David's life collapsed with terrifying speed. Vanessa's divorce proceedings were swift and merciless. Her lawyers argued that she had been defrauded by David's misrepresentation of his wealth. Because David had signed away his company for pennies to cover corporate debt, there was no massive fortune to split. But Vanessa still managed to secure the remainder of his liquid assets and the forced sale of the penthouse to cover her emotional distress and legal fees. By the time the first snow of winter began to fall in Chicago, David Sterling was standing on the curb with 2 suitcases. The silver Mercedes was gone, repossessed. The bespoke Italian suits were sold to high-end consignment shops just to pay for a deposit on a new place. He took a city bus to the far north side of the city, unlocking the door to a cramped, perpetually damp studio apartment in Rogers Park. The radiator clanked noisily, doing little to ward off the biting chill. He sat down on a cheap, second-hand mattress that lay directly on the floor. He looked around the dingy room. The peeling paint, the single flickering light bulb, the absolute silence. It was exactly like the apartment he and Felicia had shared a decade ago, back when they were eating instant noodles and dreaming of the future. Only this time, there was no beautiful, fiercely loyal woman sitting beside him, holding his hand, telling him that they were going to conquer the world together. He was entirely, agonizingly alone. He walked over to his cheap microwave, tearing the paper lid off a cup of instant ramen. The smell of the artificial sodium broth hit his nose, and for the first time since the day he handed Felicia those divorce papers, David fell to his knees on the linoleum floor and wept until he couldn't breathe. 3,000 miles away, the skyline of Seattle glittered under a crisp, starlit sky, oblivious to the ghosts of Chicago. The Vanguard Holdings corporate headquarters was ablaze with light, but the real epicenter of power that evening was the Seattle Art Museum, which had been entirely rented out and transformed into a fortress of modern wealth. It was the official launch gala for Vanguard's newest and most ambitious subsidiary, the Phoenix Initiative. When Vanguard had acquired the ashes of Sterling Tech, Nathaniel had originally planned to simply liquidate the intellectual property and sell the code for scraps to offset the minor acquisition cost. But Felicia had stepped in. She knew that code intimately. She had spent countless nights a decade ago, sitting cross-legged on a thrift store rug, proofreading the early architecture while David slept, stripping away David's bloated vanity features, his terrible user interfaces, and the shallow social networking algorithms he had prioritized to impress influencers like Vanessa. Felicia had worked directly with Vanguard's elite engineering team. Over 18 grueling months, she directed them to repurpose the core predictive algorithm. They didn't use it to match people with luxury brands. Under Felicia's ruthless, brilliant direction, they pivoted the technology entirely into the healthcare sector. She oversaw the creation of a massive, dynamic predictive model designed to help rural hospitals anticipate supply chain shortages, manage blood bank logistics, and predict patient triage needs during catastrophic weather events. Within 6 months of beta testing, the Phoenix Initiative had secured $500 million in federal and state healthcare contracts. It was a staggering, monumental victory that redefined Vanguard's tech portfolio, and Felicia Reed was the undisputed architect of it all. Inside the museum's grand foyer, beneath towering glass sculptures that caught the ambient light, a string quartet played Vivaldi over the hum of the city's elite. Tech moguls, senators, and venture capitalists clinked crystal glasses of Dom Perignon, their eyes constantly drifting toward the center of the room. Felicia stood radiant in an emerald-green Oscar de la Renta gown, the heavy silk pooling elegantly around her silver-heeled feet. She held a glass of sparkling water, holding court with the governor of Washington and 2 ranking senators. She was no longer just the wife of a billionaire. She had cemented herself as a titan of industry in her own right. "I have to admit, Mrs. Reed," the governor said, leaning in with a smile, "when Vanguard bought out that failing social app, Wall Street thought your husband was losing his touch. To turn a dying vanity project into a cornerstone of state healthcare logistics, it's nothing short of alchemy." "It wasn't alchemy, Governor," Felicia replied, her voice smooth, confident, and entirely devoid of arrogance. "It was simply a matter of stripping away the ego to find the utility. The foundation was always solid. It just needed someone who cared more about saving lives than securing VIP tables at nightclubs." A few feet away, Nathaniel stood engaged in a quiet conversation with a notoriously difficult hedge fund manager, but his piercing blue eyes never strayed far from his wife. The predatory, ice-cold billionaire softened the absolute moment he looked at her. He offered the fund manager a polite, dismissive nod and glided through the crowd, stepping up behind Felicia to wrap a strong, possessive arm around her waist. "You're the absolute center of gravity in this room," Nathaniel murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple after the politicians respectfully excused themselves. "Half these men are terrified of you, and the other half are trying to figure out how to poach you for their own boards." Felicia smiled, leaning back into his warmth, the heavy armor she wore for the world melting away in his presence. "I only work for the best, Nathaniel. They should be terrified. And besides, I like my co-chair too much to leave." "Mummy!" The elegant murmur of the gala was suddenly pierced by a bright, completely unpretentious shout. The crowd parted slightly as 3 tiny tornadoes in formal wear burst into the grand foyer. Leo and Max, looking impossibly sharp in miniature velvet dinner jackets and tiny bow ties, were chasing Mia, who looked like a fairy in a layered tulle dress that perfectly matched her mother's emerald gown. The Reeds' head night nanny trailed behind them, looking breathless and deeply apologetic. "I'm so incredibly sorry, Mr. and Mrs. Reed," the nanny gasped, smoothing her own skirt. They saw the lights from the town car window and absolutely insisted on coming in to say goodnight before we head back to the Medina estate. I couldn't stop them." "It's perfectly fine, Clara," Felicia said, her formidable business persona vanishing in a heartbeat. She knelt down right there on the polished marble floor, entirely heedless of her designer gown, and caught Mia in her arms. The little girl buried her face in Felicia's neck, giggling wildly and smelling of baby shampoo and vanilla. Nathaniel scooped up Leo and Max, one in each massive arm, groaning playfully at their combined weight. "All right, you absolute monsters. You've crashed the party, you've seen the shiny lights, and you've terrorized the senators. Time for bed." "Can we have cake first, Daddy?" Max pleaded, his dark eyes, so reminiscent of the past, yet filled with a profound, innocent joy that David could never have cultivated, looking up at Nathaniel with absolute, unwavering adoration. To Max, this towering titan of finance wasn't a billionaire. He was the man who checked under his bed for monsters every single night. "Your mother is the boss," Nathaniel grinned, looking over at Felicia, his eyes shining with a love so fierce it was almost palpable. "What's the verdict, co-chair?" Felicia looked at the beautiful, chaotic, fiercely loving family she had built from the absolute ashes of her lowest moment. She thought of the freezing rain in Chicago, the terrifying, suffocating silence of her studio apartment when she found out she was pregnant, the endless beeping monitors of the NICU where Nathaniel had held her hand. She had survived all of it. She hadn't just survived, she had conquered. "One slice of cake, split 3 ways, Felicia decreed, tapping Max on the nose. "Then straight to bed. Daddy and I will be home soon." As Nathaniel corralled the triplets toward the extravagant dessert table, Felicia stood up, smoothing the heavy silk of her skirt. She caught her reflection in the massive glass windows overlooking the dark waters of Puget Sound. She didn't see the heartbroken girl who had begged for her ex-husband's love. She saw a queen who had forged her own crown. Back in Chicago, the brutal winter wind howled off Lake Michigan, violently rattling the thin, single-pane glass of David's studio apartment in Rogers Park. He sat on the edge of his second-hand mattress, wrapped in a faded, scratchy blanket. The harsh blue glow of his cracked smartphone illuminated his hollow, exhausted face. The apartment smelled of damp plaster and the artificial sodium of the instant ramen cup sitting half-eaten on the floor. He was scrolling through a financial news app, a masochistic habit he couldn't seem to break, endlessly torturing himself with the ghost of the world he used to belong to. The headline flashed across his screen, bold, unforgiving, and universally broadcasted. Vanguard's Phoenix Initiative secures $500 million contract. Co-chair, Felicia Reed. Hailed as tech's new visionary, David's breath hitched. He clicked the article, his thumb trembling. As he read the breakdown of the technology, the blood drained from his face. Predictive modeling, healthcare logistics. It was his core algorithm. It was the very code he had written in their first apartment, the code Felicia had helped him debug. She had taken his failure, stripped away his greed, and turned it into $500 million and a legacy that would actually help the world. He had thought she was just a supportive wife, a relic of his past. He hadn't realized she was the very foundation of his success until she took her brilliance elsewhere. Below the text was a high-resolution photo from the gala. It was Felicia, looking impossibly beautiful, wealthy, and powerful, shaking hands with the governor. But it wasn't her success that made a strangled sob tear its way out of David's throat. It was the background of the photo. Just behind Felicia's shoulder, slightly out of focus but undeniably, devastatingly present, was Nathaniel Reed. The billionaire was kneeling on the floor of the gala in his bespoke suit, holding little Mia high in the air, while Leo and Max clung to his legs. All four of them were laughing uproariously. It was a picture of pure, unadulterated happiness. It was a picture of a family. His family. David stared at the glowing screen until his vision completely blurred with hot, stinging tears. He had chased the illusion of a perfect life, the young, demanding model, the flashy cars, the hollow adoration of the press and the sycophants in the VIP lounges. In doing so, he had handed the real treasure, his true legacy, and the only woman who had ever truly loved him, straight to a man who knew exactly what they were worth. He let the phone slip from his numb fingers. It clattered onto the cold linoleum floor, the screen cracking further before fading to black. David pulled his knees to his chest in the dark, freezing, silent room, surrounded only by the ghosts of his own catastrophic choices. While 3,000 miles away, the woman he had broken stepped out into the light, reigning over an empire he could only ever dream of. Life rarely offers perfect justice, but when it does, it is a masterpiece of poetic retribution. Felicia's journey from a discarded, heartbroken wife, signing away her future to a billionaire titan of industry, is a testament to the unyielding power of resilience. David Sterling traded a loyal partner for a shallow illusion, sacrificing genuine love upon the altar of his own ego. In his blindness, he didn't just lose a wife. He lost his legacy, his empire, and the beautiful family that could have been his salvation. Meanwhile, Felicia discovered that rock bottom was merely a solid foundation on which to build a fortress. Alongside Nathaniel, a man strong enough to protect her, but wise enough to let her lead, she proved that true wealth isn't measured by the balance in a bank account, but by the love, loyalty, and undeniable power of the people who stand by you when the rain falls.